Good evening, everybody. Okay, I have a PDF of this slideshow. There's a lot of text in this slides. I'm not going to read it, but it's designed so it can be a standalone presentation. There's 64 slides. 60% of them are in my paper. The other 40% is new material, and most of it's unpublished. I am not giving any credits on this or any citations. That would be found in my paper. So let's start with the show itself. Why is the Kensington Stone important to you? There are some takeaways I want to give you here. Archaeological and art fakes are major problems that plague museums and private collections. And artworks, it's estimated that 20 to 40% of artworks are fakes. Fakes swindle people out of vast sums of money, and they distort our understanding of the past. You should note that successful fakers usually work in tandem with unscrupulous experts or charlatans. The most important motives that fakers have are money, pride in deceiving experts, and perverting the course of history. And that brings us to this object here, which is the Babylonian cruciform monument, which dates from about the 8th to the 6th century BC. But its inscription is said to be 100 years earlier. This is probably the oldest archaeological hoax known. And this was probably designed by the priests in the temple to make people think that their religion they were involved in was much more ancient. The Kensington Stone is one of the world's most famous hoaxes, and there's a huge literature on it and on its discoverer, Olaf Oman, and therefore it makes a good case study to guide anybody that's going to have to work on a potential hoax in the future of something else. You should think of an archaeological hoax investigation like the investigation of a suspicious death. The artifact is the corpse. The find site's a potential crime scene, and you're going to have to collect statements from witnesses and experts in other fields and all sorts of documentation. But you also want to collect the financial records of the suspect. My paper, The Kensington Ruined Stone, Geological Evidence of a Hoax, is the autopsy report on this corpse. In my paper, I do not identify who actually made this object. Tonight, I'm going to do that. So the question is, since this has already been established by linguists as a hoax, was Olaf Oman the faker, or was he the victim of someone else? Let's go to the beginning. In late 1898, Olaf Oman, who was a Swedish immigrant farmer, showed John Hedberg a copy of some mysterious symbols on a piece of paper. Hedberg was the mayor of Kensington, and he was a real estate dealer and moneylender. Hedberg made a copy of these strange symbols, and they were sent to Ola Spreed, a professor of Scandinavian languages at the University of Minnesota. These symbols are called runes, and runes are simply alphabets that were used by the early Germans and their Scandinavian relatives. Runes were used in Sweden from about the 9th century until the early 20th century. The view on the left is an iron ring that was nailed to the Forsa parish church door, and it has one of the oldest law codes in Sweden, and it dates from the 9th to the 10th century. The view on the right is some inscription in tree that's a mixture of Latin letters and runic characters. The text that was shown to Hedberg contains the Latin letters AVM. And I picked the Forsa Church as an example because Olaf Oman was born in Forsa Parish in 1854, and he lived there until 1879 when he emigrated to America. And he saw this ring in the parish church. It was no longer nailed to the door, but it was on display there. And what I want you to understand is when he told Hedberg about his discovery, that he in fact knew what ruins looked like, and he was pretending not to know what they looked like. On January the 14th in 1899, Professor Breda published his conclusion that Hedberg's copy was a hoax written in modern ruins. Ullman immediately turned around and made a copy and sent it to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. This became a sensation in the Chicago newspapers, and at least 3 newspapers published engravings of the copy that Ullman sent. And what I want to draw your attention to is there was a copying error in the date 1362. It appears that he wrote 1462 and then changed his mind and changed it to 1362. And the purpose for showing that is this crops up in all 3 engravings, and so they must be reasonable copies of the copy that Ullman sent. The text in this copy that Ullman sent is exactly the same as the text that was in Hedberg's copy. The runes are the same, the words are the same. In 1899, 2 newspapers referred to Ullman's copy as a tracing, and that means that it was done on tracing paper. If you're not familiar with it, it's translucent paper that's laid over drawings or lettering or whatever you want to copy, and then tracing over them with a pen or pencil. Ullman earned much of his living as a carpenter, and he would have used tracing paper in the course of his work to modify working drawings and blueprints. In March of 1899, Professor Kerm at Northwestern University concluded the text was a fake. He agreed with Breda's conclusion. Also, 2 experts in Norway, Gustav Storm and Olaf Rigg, declared the text was made by a Swede with a little skill with a chisel and some slight knowledge of runes and of English. Ever since then, specialists in runology and medieval history have considered the text to be a hoax. The bottom line on this is, once you get past the strange alphabet, the text is written in 19th century Swedish. I'm going to come back to this tracing later because there's evidence for it on the stone itself. In 1907, Holland gave his Kensington Stone to Hjalmar Ruud Holland. Holland was a Norwegian immigrant who studied at the University of Wisconsin, but he after obtaining the stone, he decided that these professors, Breed, Kerm, and Storm, and Rigg, were all wrong, and that the stone was really genuine. And he spent the next 50 years crusading for this stone. He wrote several books and several papers, and he fancied himself as being the expert. Archaeological artifacts are authenticated by experts. And so the question I leave to you is, who is an expert? How do you select a person that's an expert? In 1909, Olaf Ullman signed an affidavit describing his discovery and the fact that he did not recognize ruins when he first dug up the stone. Ullman at that time claimed the discovery was in August of 1898. In his reports to Hedberg and to Kerm at Northwestern, he said it was discovered in November of 1898. That's a profound discrepancy. Lying in an affidavit is a crime, perjury. I want to say that. In 1928, Holland sold the Kensington Stone for $2,500 to a group of businessmen in Alexandria, Minnesota. And that's where it is today. That formed the basis of the Runestone Museum. At that time, that amount of money would have gotten a pretty nice automobile. A Model A Ford sold for a little under $900, and a Cadillac sold for about $3,300. So you would get a Buick or something like that for $2,500. That's a fair amount of money. And just ask yourself what you'd do if somebody swindled you out of, that amount of money. Holland and his buyer that they had relied on Olaf Ullman's claims in this affidavit. Selling a fake runestone is fraud. It's also a crime. And this is true of most of the archaeological hoax that are investigated. They usually involve some amount of money that's exchanged for an artifact. And so what I'm trying to make you understand is that hoax investigation is really a fraud investigation, and you need the skill sets of a fraud investigator. Not many geologists have looked at the stone, but 2 geologists found the stone to be genuine. These were Winchell in 1910 and Scott Walter in 2003. Winchell decided the inscription was basically unweathered. He had said that the marble gravestones in New England were more weathered if they were 30 years old. But he thought that burial had protected the stone, and that accounted for its relatively unweathered condition. Walter, on the other hand, claimed that the runestone was more weathered than 200-year-old slate tombstones in Maine. What I want you to take away with this is these two men have come to opposite reasonings for the same conclusion. One, to Winchell, the stone is not weathered enough. To Walter, it's weathered too much. So the rationale, and the fact that they have declared the stone to be genuine is at odds with the runologists. So which discipline is right, geology or runology? So let's go to the geology and have a look at the stone. The photo on the left here is the stone in the 1990s, and it shows the stone is, bulk of the stone is made up of this bluish gray sandstone. Since there's mud between the sand grains, it's called a graywacky. And also this stone tends to break off in thin layers, flags, so it's called also a flagstone. The other rock type on this stone is this thin white veneer of material that is made mostly of the mineral calcite. When the stone was sent to Kerm in 1899, it was determined that this white layer was made from cement or lime mortar. And Portland cement was invented in 1824, so that would mean the stone was a fake. On the other hand, lime mortars were well known in the Middle Ages. The top photo is the remains of a church in Greenland. There's lime mortar between the stones there, and it probably was covered with a stucco coating. Lime mortars, when they're used as a paint-like coating, are called stuccos. The church in the bottom left-hand side is a church in Norway that's about the same age, and it shows these white stucco coating that's been renewed over the years, so it looks fresh, whereas the lime stucco coating in the Greenland church have weathered away. Lime stuccos were also used extensively in the 19th century. The best example I can give you is Arlington House, which was Robert E. Lee's mansion in Virginia. This was made by slaves out of bricks, and the bricks were covered with a thick coating of lime mortar, which then had a veining painted on it. So it mimics a full marble facade like a Greek temple. Regardless of whether this was made of cement or lime mortar, it would have taken days or weeks for the stucco to harden sufficiently to take a chisel impression. And furthermore, the 14th century North would not have brought with them barrels of lime, nor set up a lime kiln in the Kensington area. And I call this the kiss of death. I mean, this is definitely shows the artifact is a fake. This alone shows it's a fake without looking at anything else. We'll move on to where this stone came from. There are no rock outcrops in the Kensington area. And farmers use glacial boulders for their stone needs to make foundations and basements of their farms. When Holland found the Kensington Stone in 1907, he saw it being used as a stepping stone to Ullman's granary, and it was being used as an anvil to straighten nails and harnesses. There are also many other eyewitnesses who saw it being used in this fashion. And the point is, this is a laser scan of the back of the stone. Winchell had thought because of these scratches, the stone was a glacial boulder, because occasionally glacial boulders have scratches on them called glacial striations. These are atypical for glacial striations. They're usually not curved, and they usually don't cross one another. It can happen, but this is unusual. On the other hand, you can see the stone, the back is missing pieces, and there is a series of percussion marks. There are probably over 100 of these little percussion marks on the back, and they look like they're made from the right corner of a hammer, like a mason's hammer, some kind of tool with a square rectangular face. And someone has also used them to probably clean out these scratches. In my view, this is not a glacial boulder, or these are not glacial striations. The Kensington area is covered with several hundred feet of glacial deposits, which date from the last glaciation 11,000 years ago. And these materials came from Manitoba and flowed south with the Des Moines lobe. The materials that are entrapped in the glacial tills are from the Riding Mountain area in Manitoba, and they consist of shales, limestones, and an assemblage of metamorphic and igneous rocks. There are also some gray wacky boulders or cobbles found in the tills. These are called omars. They do not look anything like the Kensington stone. They're finer grained, and they have these little concretions in them. They would look like ping pong balls. Here you see one weathered out. None of these stones match the Kensington stone. Furthermore, residents in the area many of them have stated that there are no stones in the area that look like the Kensington stone. The most important resident is Arthur Ullman, who was the son of the discoverer. In fact, I heard a radio interview with him, the recording of this interview from 1978. It's on the Morris campus website if you want to go look for it. At the end of his interview, he says there's no stone like this stone in the area. I mean, this artifact weighs 202 pounds, and it's unlikely that the Norse in 1362 would have brought this stone tablet with them to make a potential monument. And this is another one of those things I call the kiss of death. I mean, it's not a local stone, and it's from somewhere else, and therefore the stone's a fake. In the 19th century, there was an extensive trade in sandstone slabbing. Today, we make sidewalks out of concrete. Back then, these were made from sandstones. This is a sandstone pavement in front of the Brooklyn, New York borough house that from a few years ago. You can see that it looks very much like the Kensington stone. It's a blue-gray, it's a flagstone. It breaks off into these thin layers. These blue stones came from the border area between New York and Pennsylvania. This is an ad from the from the Minneapolis Tribune from 1884, and it's from the Minnesota Stone Company. They were importers of this bluestone sidewalk slabbing. This North River today is called the Hudson River. So these were New York and Pennsylvania bluestones. The photo at the bottom is from a firm that was in Kensington. It was called the Kensington Ornamental and Cement Works. They made faux marble grave borders. And these were made by molding cement over a substrate of cheaper rocks, such as sandstone. Ole Sarsland was the owner of this firm, and he was a neighbor of Olaf Ullman's. His son Willie threshed Ullman's wheat crop in the September of 1898, and at that time he saw the stone. So this is a possible explanation of how a gray wacky like the Kensington stone got into the Kensington area. We'd need to do a bit more work to make that certain, but there are other sources of sandstones that were imported into Minnesota as well. Let's have a look at the weathering of this stone. This is a photograph from 1910. What you want to note about it is there are two rock types, the gray wacky and then this stucco layer. They have quite different hardnesses. It's much harder to cut an inscription into gray wacky than it is into the stucco. And yet the carver has made the ruins the same size and depth in both rock types. So he controls that by how hard he hammers the chisel into the rock. The weathering rates of rocks range between 1 and 100 millimeters per 1,000 years. And the inscription is less than 2 millimeters deep. And the artifact was 536 years old in 1898. So we would expect the rock to have lost between half a millimeter and 50 millimeters from the surface. In most cases, that would be well enough to have obliterated much of the inscription. Now I'll go on into the specifics of the weathering here. This is a panel of marble tombstone monuments that were popular in the 19th century in various states of decay. This upper left-hand corner shows a fresh marble surface that was polished, maybe even to a mirror finish. As the marble weathers, it takes on a sandy appearance, and the letters begin to round, and eventually they disappear. And finally, they're going to disappear altogether like a sugar cube dissolving in a cup of tea. And what's doing that is rainwater, which forms a weak acid because it's absorbed carbon dioxide from the air. So it's over time, it's weathering away marble. Think of the stucco layer on the Kensington Stone as being a thin marble veneer. This is a map of weathering rates of marble tombstones over the eastern United States. This sample spot here is probably Alexandria, Minnesota, near the Kensington Stone. The weathering rate there is a little more than 0.6 of a millimeter per 100 years. It's millimeters per 100 years as a scale for this map. And that would mean that the stone should have lost 3 millimeters in 500 years. Now, even if the veneer were thicker in 1362, the tops and bottoms of the ruins would have been rounded and they would have been obliterated by it. So they should look something like this if it was 6 meters thick and the stone were now weathered down to 3 millimeters. Let's look at some marble tombstones in the Minneapolis area. This is one from the 1870s. Half the inscription is gone. This is a variety of tombstones from the same cemetery. Again, you see this inscriptions rounding and gradually disappearing. I want to concentrate on this rune stone on the right and compare it to the Kensington Stone. The letters in the stone are 1 inch tall, and the runes in the Kensington Stone are 1 inch tall. So these are about the same scale. Notice that this sandy texture develops both on the uninscribed portions of the stone and along the letters of the stone. For the Kensington Stone, in this stucco layer, there's a rough texture, maybe a sandy texture on the uninscribed portion, but the inscribed portions are smooth and look as crisp as the day they were found. Look at these points, these conical points here. And I think this again shows that the stone is a fake. It's insufficiently weathered. Let's turn our attention to the sandstone. In 2003, the stone was stained a dark brown, almost black color. And what it shows is the fact that sandstones are porous rocks. And they act like sponges when they're in the ground, and they absorb and lose water during the natural wet and dry cycles of the weather. Water tends to also to wick along the bedding planes of the stone, and we'll see what happens to it. This phenomenon is called ice wedging. And what happens is water goes down the joints or the bedding planes in the stone, and when it freezes to ice, it expands and breaks apart the rock. And here are a couple of tombstones that have starting to delaminate or split apart. A wonderful resource is this NIST stone wall in Washington, D.C. This was constructed in 1948 of hundreds of stones. They're igneous stones, sedimentary stones, metamorphic stones, but I want to focus on some sandstones that are in this enlargement of part of the wall. This photograph was taken in 2000, and this is a bluestone from New York. And it's very similar lithology or lith composition to the Kensington Stone. And you can see that the sandstone is blistering and it's going to fall off. This is what the stone looked like in 1948. And look at the sandstones that are surrounding it. They're beginning to fall apart as well. The sandstones are fairly vulnerable to weathering. And we're going to concentrate on this bedding plane. There are two bedding planes you see here, one at the top and the one on the bottom of this step. And water would wick in along the bedding plane underneath this top flag, and it should have expanded and cracked away parts of the inscription. And that, of course, has not happened. Again, this is an indicator that the stone is a fake. Now, I want to go to the discovery staging that Mr. Ullman did. The only eyewitnesses on record are Olaf Ullman and his 9-year-old son, Edward. Ullman claimed that he could not have been the faker, even if the stone was a fake, because he knew nothing about ruins in 1898. And we've dealt with that one already, and we'll talk a bit more about it later on. But he also claimed that he couldn't have faked it because it was found tightly clasped in the roots of a 10-inch aspen tree. It would have taken several decades for the tree to grow. Now, he took possession of his farm in 1891, and he bought the land in 1890 from Ole Amundsen. Amundsen got the land from the state of Minnesota, which got it from the United States, which got it from the Dakota natives. The language on the stone is Swedish, and it could not have been composed by Amundsen, who was a Norwegian immigrant. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is in 1899, Ullman gave a completely different discovery scenario. He said that it was thought that he was a Norwegian, that his sons were Norwegians and they were all farmers. He didn't mention that they were boys. He was preparing a field for grubbing. He was draining a swamp, in fact, and he claimed that the stone was buried 6 feet underground, and his son dug down to dig it out and struck the stone. And it was so tightly clasped in a root that part of it broke off, and that would explain perhaps those broken parts on the back. And Ullman sent a drawing of this to the Minneapolis newspaper. So he has a little swamp here. This is it's called a slough. You can't read the writing on his drawing, but that's the marsh surrounding the find site. The first person to see this stone, aside from the Ullman family, was Niels Flatten. He's Ullman's next door neighbor. He also signed an affidavit in 1909. And again, he said the stone was found in August, but he couldn't see anything during the excavation because there was too much undergrowth. And Ullman had called him over and showed him the excavated stone, the stump, and 2 flattened roots. And he said his son was the first person to recognize writing on the stone. A few months later, Ullman wrote a letter to the Minnesota Historical Society, and he made a drawing of the stone under this aspen tree. And he also said that he thought at the time the stone was an Indian almanac. This is a topographic map of Ullman's farm. And so this is the road that runs past it. This is Ullman's farmhouse. And it's now a park, of course. And so this is the turnaround of the park. And the discovery site is right about here, because Winchell reported that it's being 40 feet above the marsh. So this is the marsh. So you'd be close to the top of the hill. The hill is about 55 feet tall. And this is in Ullman's farm in section 14. I'll just remind you that a section is 1 square mile. Winchell reported that the boulders in the area were found at the tops and bottoms of hills only. And this can be explained by a phenomenon called creep or mass wasting. If you walk around the town or anywhere, you'll see retaining walls that are beginning to lean. You'll see tombstones that lean that are on a hill. You'll see fences on a hill that are leaning. Power poles will lean. Trees will start to lean and they'll try to right themselves. And they'll have a very characteristic J shape to the bottom of the stump. There'll be cracks in foundations. And what's going on is this top layer of soil is actually flowing down slope. Boulders on the surface are also going to wander down to the bottom of the hill. This phenomenon takes place in the order of inches a year. So what that means, if a stone was at the top of the hill in 1362, it should have been found at the bottom of the hill in 1898. And the fact that it was not found there is another indicator the stone artifact is probably a fake. Let's look at some things specific to aspen trees. These are real aspen trees in silhouette here. They're drawn to the same size as the drawing that Winchell gave of the Kensington Stone buried underneath a aspen stump. And the thing I want to note about it is these fine rootlets that just permeate the stone. You should find them around here. And think of the stone as being an almond embedded in a cotton ball. And these aspen roots are like the cotton fibers. In the Mediterranean, when Roman and Greek marble sculptures are unearthed, they tend to have a network of scars on the surface of the marble because roots will etch marble. In fact, there are several experiments done to show this. And here are some marble plates that were etched by pea roots after 25 days. And so I would ask you, what would happen to the Kensington Stone's calcite rich layer if it were buried for 25 years in something like this? And we would expect a network of these kinds of scars on it, the Kensington Stone itself, and of course none are to be found. This is a soil map of the Kensington area superimposed over the satellite image. I'll just make a remark about that while I think about it, about that affidavit. This is Niels Flatten's farmhouse, and this is about the site where the runestone was found. That distance is 1,200 feet. In the affidavit, they all claim that the distance was 500 feet from Niels Flatten's house, which would put it right there. And I don't know if that's a mistake in the affidavit or this was actually what they thought at the time and changed their mind later on when they came up with a different story. Getting back to the soil map, the soils in this area are mosaics of Wakhan and Langhide loams. The Wakhan loam is found under trees and the Langhide loam under grasslands. So it would be a Wakhan loam that would be found under the aspen tree. There are about 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today. And plant roots under an aspen generates between 7,000 parts per million and 24,000 parts per million of carbon dioxide. The effect of that is that they make the water about 10 times more acidic than rainwater. You can think of roots as being carbon dioxide pumps. As trees take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, they exude about 1/3 of that carbon dioxide through their roots, and they're spraying whatever is in the soils. This is a chemical analysis of a Wakhan loam site. It's about 10 miles to the east of the Ullman Farm. This is the C horizon, which is the unweathered till, and then the A horizon is the very topmost layer of the soil, which we've called the zone of leaching. The B horizon is not analyzed in this, but it would grade from the material in the C horizon to the material in the A horizon. But I want to draw your attention to the calcite in the C horizon. Originally, there was about 8% calcite, and that's leached down to by this percolating rainwater that's been charged with excess carbon dioxide by the plant roots. It's been leached down to less than 1%. There have also been some experiments that have looked at this. This is an experiment by Day in southwestern Wisconsin in 1984. Day took some limestone tablets, he left them at the surface and planted them at various depths below the surface. He came back a few years later and looked at the change in weight. They all lost more material at depth than they did at the surface. And they and other experiments as well have estimated that the weathering rate at the depth is about 1.5 times faster than the rate above ground. What that means in effect is Winchell's assumption that burial would have protected the stone is not true. Putting this all together, it means that the stone is a fake. It would have weathered much faster than the condition that it's in now, and that Olaf Ullmann had lied about his discovery scenario. Let's go to the tool marks on the stone. I want to look at the construction of the artifact. And we need to consider three kinds of technologies: 14th century stonemason, 19th century stonemason, and 19th century farmers. The illustration on the left are Roman tools. And the illustration on the right are 19th century American stonemason tools. Medieval tools would have been pretty much like the Roman tools. And if you went to a tool shop today to get tools, you would still get tools pretty much that looked like this. And they're not all that different from the Roman tools. The big differences are this bush hammer and these rock drills. They would not have been found in medieval times or in Roman times. The other takeaway I would like you to have is that the heavy hammers and chisels and points were also used by blacksmiths. And so a person that has heavy blacksmith tools could also do rudimentary stone carving. These chisels and points that are used to engrave the text would quickly wear down in sandstone and need to be resharpened. So one scheme is to use a flattened piece of sandstone called a whetstone. And this is a sculpture of a Roman using a whetstone. This is a whetstone from York from about 800 AD. And this is a man making whetstones that were used to sharpen scythes and chisels. They were carried in, this is from the 19th century, and they were carried in the farm laborer's belt. To make these whetstones, you have to take a piece of sandstone and dress it into a flat piece of stone. So you can't just grab sandstone at random. A quicker way of sharpening stones is using a grinding wheel. This is grinding wheels from the Middle Ages, and this is a grinding wheel from the 1898 Sears catalog. We know that Olaf Ullmann owned a grinding wheel very similar to this. So one person would turn this crank, another person would push the tool up against the rotating rim of this grinding wheel. We have anecdotal evidence that Olaf Ullmann's oldest son, turned the crank on his grinding stone when he was sharpening the chisels, when he was carving the runestone inscription. And we'll have some more on that later. Stonemasons in the Middle Ages and stonemasons in the 19th century, and even today, do pretty much the same thing. They take blocks of rock, they fashion them into rectilinear blocks and with flat dressed faces. So what you're seeing, this is an illustration from Nuremberg, and this is from Texas in the 19th century. Stonemasons at work in the Middle Ages. Here we show a stonemason mixing lime mortar and other stonemasons fashioning stone shapes for use in a cathedral. But I especially want to draw you to this illustration because here you see the stonemasons have a number of chisels laid out on the top of the stone. And what happened is the blacksmith, either in town or at the quarry, is sharpening the chisels for use the next day, and they would exchange these, or they'd have an apprentice go back and get new chisels. And I want you to think about if this were made in 1362 by some Norse and they happen to have a chisel with them, they would be pretty slow going. The text on the runestone has, after we came home, we found 10 men red from blood and death. And you would think, given the fact that they found these men dead, that they would be in a hurry to make this monument and get out of Dodge, if you will. While the runestone was discovered, the Minnesota State Capitol was being constructed. And these are various scenes from stonemasons in St. Paul making these rectilinear blocks like they did in the Middle Ages. Here's a marble facade on the front of the Capitol building. Here they're making a hollow cornerstone in 1898. I want to draw your attention to this upper right-hand illustration. And this is the recent renovations of the Capitol. And you can see the marble has begun to being eaten away by rainwater. And so they needed to renew some of the structure. Let's go through what happened to the stone itself. We know the stone was much larger because pieces of it were broken off, and it might have been 300 pounds or more. To make this stone, pieces were pried off the front of the stone, a stucco coating was applied, probably over a much wider area, and then pieces were broken off at B, C, and D. And we know that was broken off after the stucco because the stucco goes right to this margin. It's a clean break. It's like cutting frosting on a cake. The side E has also been dressed into a flat face. One of the thoughts might be that when they were making something out of this piece of raw stone, it may be this material that was the material of interest, and what was left over to make the rune stone was actually scrap material. It's just a thought that you might want to think about. Let's look at various methods of splitting stones. There are two ways of doing it, one with the grain and one against the grain, and they all involve using wedges. The top of the stone has got these, you see this pattern here. Quarrymen in bluestone quarries call this reed. I think you can see this as like a bundle of reeds, this pattern on the rock here. These are actually current lineations. Water that runs through beaches or river sands leaves these rills as the water is moving through, and these get fossilized in the rock. These are planes of weakness, and they become planes of parting where the flags can be split off. And so there are a number of steps that were split off of this stone before the stucco coating was. And this is the oldest, and this is the next oldest, and we go down the stone to younger and younger pieces that have been broken off. The illustration at the upper right is in a Scottish quarry in the 1930s, and it shows a workman breaking up a sandstone into slabs, and he's using a wedge, and then he's using a crowbar to peel apart this flat slab. The bottom photograph is a man in India doing the same thing, but he's just using a simple chisel, and he's hammering it, and he's working it back and forth to break off these thin flags of sandstone. If you're going to break it against the grain, you have to do a different scheme. The bottom photo shows how this is done. A line would be scribed in the rock, and then a wedge would be inserted a short distance into the rock. A second wedge would be inserted, and then a third wedge would be inserted, and then the workman would come back to the first wedge and hammer it a little deeper, little deeper, little deeper, and he would go back and forth again and again and again until the rock split in this planar fashion. And this is controlled by the type of rock and the spacing of the wedges. There are scars in the back of this face on the runestone where material has been split off, showing that they're about the 3 to 4 inches that would be used in wedging. And there's some other scars along here as well. This suggests that this flat face was achieved by doing that. The opposite side of the inscribed face is the uninscribed face, and that is also dressed. Winchell said this was done by bush hammering. Bush hammers looks like this is like a large meat tenderizer if you have one of those devices in your kitchen. The bush hammer was not known in 1362. It didn't first come into use until the 15th century. Another thing, if the bush hammer had existed in the 13th century and was used to hammer this rock, it would have micro-cracked it and subjected to much more accelerated weathering, and this flat surface would not remain after 500 years. And that was something that was found out in Prague, and after World War II, they had buildings made out of sandstone that were deteriorating, and they were built in the late Middle Ages. And so they took from the same quarries rock, they bush hammered the surfaces, and lo and behold, after a decade or two, they were falling apart. So if you're doing restoration work, don't use a bush hammer. The photo on the left here is the steamship passenger list for the steamship England from 1886. And Olaf Oman was returning to the United States from Sweden at that time, and he's listed as a carpenter as his profession. He made most of his money as a carpenter. The photo on the right is a barn that is about half a mile from his house that he made on the Matson property. And I want to show you the stonework in the barn here. Oman had, you can see it's fairly crude. They're not well dressed, and he's lavished mortar to cover up the poor workmanship. This is a map of Oman's farm, and this is a photograph of the farmhouse before it was taken as a park. And this is a photograph of the basement of this farmhouse. And again, you see this crude stonework with lots of mortar. The top right photo is an ad from the 1910 newspaper, Swedish newspaper, the Svenska Amerikanska Posten. That ad was placed by Olaf Oman for barrel making. And being a carpenter, he would be well trained to make the staves in the barrel, but he also would need to make these iron hoops. These were made from iron ribbon. They were bent around. Holes were drilled at the two ends, and a rivet was placed in those holes and hammered together to form a round hoop. He would need an anvil, a heavy hammer, perhaps a chisel or a saw to cut the iron ribbon. He would need a center punch to place the holes, and a drill to drill them, and of course the rivets. And what is found on Oman's farm is the foundations to a blacksmith shop. So we know that Oman owned a blacksmith shop and had blacksmith tools. We're going to now move to the layout on the inscription here. You can see how nice the inscription is in nice even lines. This is a runestone from Sweden on the left. It's there are about 2,000 of them there, and most of them have irregular texts on them. They run around the margins of the stone. They may run in a design, but the letters are not the same length, and the stone is quite irregular. On the right-hand image is a plate from that we know that Olaf Oman possessed. He had got a copy of this in the late 1898. And you can see the ruins in this engraving of this bell are written out in a nice lines, just like the text in the stone itself. The lengths of these ruins are almost exactly 1 standard US inch. This is something that Birgitta Wallace pointed out a few years ago, but this is not a measurement that was used in medieval Scandinavia, and it indicates the stone is a fake. This is a Roman cavalryman's tombstone, and with very nicely carved letters. These letters were carved by using a small chisel and gradually chipping away the bevels of the inscription. That is not how the inscription is done in the Kensington Stone. What was done there is a chisel was placed against the rock and was hammered again and again and again and again until the appropriate depth was attained. Essentially, the inscription is embossed in the rock and not carved. And there's some evidence for this. One is this piece that was popped out of one of the lines. This is a laser scan enlargement of that piece. You'll see this punch mark here. That could not have been made after this piece popped out, because if it did, all this would have given away. So what had happened is part of the inscription was made, and then this piece came loose, and so they had to redo the text in the bottom of this piece that popped out. Winchell noted that the ruins had a white powder on them and iron fragments. That can be explained by a phenomenon called stunning or bruising the stone. That happens when the carver does this technique. He takes the chisel, makes it perpendicular to the stone, and hammers it with heavy blows. And sandstones are prone to this bruising. Winchell was told by Holland that this came from scratching the stone with a nail. And that is not the case, because when we look at the ruins, if you'd cleaned out the ruins with a nail, you would see scratch marks on the faces of these ruins, and they don't appear anywhere. Let's go to the text itself. Look at the various tools used in making the text. The letters of the text were laid out, and then the ends of them were struck with a slight punch mark. So you can see these little punch marks at the ends of these long ruins. Heavy punch marks were used to make the word spacers, which look like colons. And the long chisels were used for the lengths of the ruins. Smaller chisels were used for other parts of the ruins. These chisels illustrated at the top here are the types of pointed chisels that were used in the Middle Ages. These are called points. They were used in Roman times as well. You notice that they're faceted pyramids, and they leave pyramidal tool marks in the stonework. The illustration at the top right is from the 1898 Sears and Roebuck catalog for a center punch. Here's a center punch with the punch marks in clay. Center punches are made by taking a piece of steel, putting them in a lathe, and spinning them, and pushing a grinding stone against the tip to make that conical tip. Center punches are a metalworking tool. This is the inscription on the Kensington Stone. It shows you these punches in these conical punch marks. This is done by that type of tool and not by the faceted tool. Again, this shows that the artifact was made in the 19th century. As I noted, the long marks on chisels were made by making punch marks at the end and then taking a chisel and placing it in there and hammering it again and again. This particular ruin, there was an accident done in the carving. If you look at it, that punch mark is just to the left of the long stroke here. So it was off axis. And if the top picture here shows in clay the tool marks made by a chisel. So you get this box-like structure with a beveled interior, and the sides will be pyramidal. These pyramid-like marks are made when the chisel point is struck into the surface at an angle. It appears that the long chisel used by Oman had the tips ground off so they wouldn't create this box-like structure. That was a carpenter techniques. Carpenters will take their plane iron and they'll grind off the tips of them so the plane doesn't mar the work surface. Another type of tool mark is this one. This is has a boxed bottom. It's like a square tool. The tool that would make that, the modern tool, is a screwdriver, or a 19th century tool. And I don't know of any 14th century tool that would make a tool mark like that. Now, certainly they could have made one, but what use would they have had for it? Okay, let's move to this tracing again. Now, the thing you would note about the tracing is the Kensington Stone has added a word to the text. There's been a spelling change in this line, and there's been some minor spelling change, but there's been a major spelling change in the word blood, and I want to look at that first. There are two runes used on the Kensington Stone for the sound O. One is this umlauted O with a runic N in the center, and the other is a runic O. The word on the tracing for blood uses the umlauted O with the runic N in the interior. The word on the stone uses the rune for the letter O. Now, Oman claimed that he had made a copy of the stone in his tracing. If he were making a copy and made a copying error, he would have, in order to preserve the sound of these words, he would have, his substitution of one O sound for the other means that he knew what these runes signified. And so he was not copying them blind. He actually knew the stone was a fake, whether he made the stone or not. This shows at least that. Now let's move to this problem that's in line 5. This line 5 has a change in wording from the tracing. The tracing has nor with one R and from with an M on it. The stone has nor with two R's and from has lost the M. So you have, find it here. There's from, and there's nor from. And this is nor from here, nor fro. And what has happened, and again, this is something that Birgitta Wallace pointed out, there's a little punch mark at the bottom of the second R in the stone. And what appears happened is they started to make one of these word spacers, as was in the rough draft or in the tracing draft. And then instead they carved an R over it. And then once they did that, there's not enough room left on the back of, to the left of the stone to add another letter. So they have to lose a letter somewhere. So they lose the M from turn it to fro. Incidentally, from is an English word and fro is the Scandinavian equivalent. They both mean the word from. Both of these words are used elsewhere in the inscription. A 14th century inscriber would not have used two spellings for the word from. He would have picked one or the other. This also suggests that there might be two authors to the text. I'm, well, getting ahead of myself, but let's move on. What this indicates, this copying error, is that this tracing was in fact the rough draft from which the stone inscription was made. There's a lot of inconsistencies in Oman's statements over the years, and I'm just going to hit a few of them. What we do when we test witnesses, whether they're telling the truth or not, is we look for inconsistencies with other statements, with inconsistencies with other witnesses, or with inconsistencies with physical evidence. And I'm not going to go through all of them, I'll just hit a couple of them here. The Minneapolis Tribune in 1899 reported that Olaf Oman had gone into hiding. He had become scared and concerned, and that's hardly the behavior of a man who was innocent, but that also meant that he would not have been available to question. In 1910, Winchell had asked Oman about this affidavit he signed in 1909. In 1909, the affidavit says, since then I kept it at my farm until August 1907 when I presented the stone to H.R. Holland. He's talking about the stone, which he gave to Holland in August. He told Winchell, Mr. Oman says he never gave the stone to Holland, and if he signed such a statement, he did not know it, he did not read it at all, and he never gave the stone to Holland. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Oman stood in front of the notary public, Riley Rasmussen, who was the cashier at the Kensington Bank, and he raised his hand and swore the document he was about to sign was the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That little ritual has to be done by the notary. It's a requirement under the law that he takes the oath of the signer. The notary is an official of the state who can get oaths. And that's why if you lie in signing an affidavit, you've committed the crime of perjury. Disavowing an affidavit is an admission to committing perjury. Now that's not that the point I want to make about this. In 1910, the Minnesota Historical Society was twice advised to have an attorney question Mr. Oman, which they never did. An attorney would have zeroed in on these statements and forced more material out of Mr. Oman. He would have had Mr. Oman and his son come in and give some additional testimony, and you would have seen some sparks fly, I'm sure. Mr. Oman had a neighbor, John Gran. John Gran's children, Walter and Josephine, said their father told him that he helped the Oman carve the stone and that Oman's oldest son turned the grinding wheel to sharpen the chisels. Now, Eric Walden, in researching his book, was in the Kensington area, and a gentleman told him that Olaf Ullmann's son had complained at a picnic how hard it was turning the chisel and sharpening or turning the grinding stone when he was sharpening the chisels. Olaf Emil was 10 years old at the time. He was a young boy having to help his father and John Gran carve this stone. I also found this memo that was Warren Upham, who was the secretary of the Minnesota Historical Society, written to himself in 1914. He'd run into a janitor at I think at a church, and who had once lived in Kensington. And he told, the janitor told Upham that Olaf Ullmann had fashioned a cemetery monument for someone at one point. And that just brings me back to that Ole Sarsland's firm, the Kensington Ornamental and Cement Works. They made cemetery monuments, and maybe Mr. Ullmann helped out in that. In late 1897 or early 1898, Olaf Ullmann had clipped this history of Sweden by Oscar Montelius out of the pages of the Svenska Amerikanska Posten. The newspaper serialized this history book. Ullmann clipped them out and had them bound in leather, and these were printed in, I think, through the last 2 months of 1897, the first 2 months of 1898. Ullmann did not tell anybody about them, and this was found after his death. And in 1938, Mrs. Ullmann loaned it to John Holvik, who then had pages microfilmed at the Minnesota Historical Society. And the point is, Olaf Ullmann secreted this book. And this book has numerous engravings of rune stones. And here's this bell again. It has sections on the use of runes, on the history of the Swedish language. So certainly by the time Mr. Ullmann dug up this mysterious stone, he would have known that the writing on it was runes and not an Indian almanac. Whether he carved it or not, he would have known that. Furthermore, the Montelius book has sufficient information in it to get all the historical information that's contained in the inscription itself. The inscription, if we boil down the historical material in there, is a group of Swedes and Norwegians came west from Finland in 1362. The Montelius says on page 292, I've got the English translation of his Swedish, the connection between the Nordic countries and America continued for a long time. In 1347, there is an account of journey. I can't see all of that because of the picture here. Let me see here. I can do this. There we go. Sorry. In 1347, there is a record of a company's journey from Greenland to Vinland, and possibly these voyages continued even longer, and so on. In another page, Montelius has a king list for Sweden, and he has Håkan became the king of Sweden, both the Swedes and the Norwegians in 1362. And what I'm making out here is that this would have been the information that would be needed for the information for the historical matters on the text itself. In the last 20 years, various documents and inscriptions have been found of ruins in Sweden. This is a letter from the Larson brothers that was found in 2000. This is a couple years ago. Some school children were on a field trip to a farmhouse that is 25 miles to the northwest of where Olaf Ullmann was born, and they found this graffiti made by farmhands. Now, all the use of the letter X for the sound of the letter A was not done in the 14th century. It was done in the 19th century, in 19th century ruins. But the rune stone and this Larson brothers letter and this graffiti all have an extra embellishment of that. They have a little hook on the X. And so you can see again, this stone, there's a source for Mr. Ullmann getting these ruins to use on his stone. Mr. Ullmann did not get the idea for writing this stone inscription. It wasn't an original thought with him. There was a short story published in August of 1898 called A Runestone. And it's about a farmer in Sweden who carves a runestone and shows it to some scholars at Lund University. And this illustration is from a anthology from 1905. And so what we have with the Kensington Stone is we have reality following fiction. Now let's get to the final phase of this, is follow the money. Olaf Ullman came to the United States in 1879. He returned to Sweden in 1883, and he came back to the United States in 1886. He married his wife, Karen, that year, and they started a family. And he began in 1890 to buy sections of a farm in section 14, which is about 3 miles to the northeast of Kensington. Below is a picture of the Ullman family in 1893. So there's Olaf Ullman. He's the serious man of status. His wife, Karen. On Olaf's lap is their child, Arthur. Between them is their son, Edward. The baby is Amanda, their daughter. And standing behind them is Olaf Emil. He's thinking about what he's going to have to do to turn that grinding stone. The next year, in 1894, Olaf Ullman bought some real estate in section 28. Today, it's just west of the village of Kensington. In 1894, it was actually inside the boundary of Kensington. But he bought 158.55 acres of land for $2,500. At that time, that was a stupendous sum. The average annual wage was $400. And so where did he get that kind of money to begin with? It has a $500 mortgage on it, but still he would have to come up with the rest of it. In early 1899, the newspapers reported that Olaf Ullman could not pay the $25 in property tax on this land in section 28. Now that's an alert that alerts the owner, and it alerts other people in the community that if he doesn't pay his property tax, there will be a sheriff's sale and the tax would be sold by the county. So he certainly knew about that in 1898, that he's going to have problems, and he must have been worrying more and more. In the summer of 1898, the wheat prices collapsed. Now we know that Mr. Ullman was growing wheat because Willie Sarsland threshed his wheat in September. That wheat had to have been planted in the fall of 1897, when wheat was selling for about 80 cents a bushel. And it was thought it would go up to $1 a bushel. So good times were coming, but there was a collapse of the wheat prices in the middle of the summer of 1898. And so he got about 60 cents a bushel. And so you can see the squeeze that he's in, and more importantly, his neighbors. They're all facing the fact that they're not going to get very much money that year. And that means that they can't pay for his carpentry services. And so we have, at the end of the year, Mr. Ullman goes to visit John Hedberg, who is the mayor of Kensington, as I said. He's also a money lender, and he's also a real estate dealer, and his office is in the hardware store just north of the tracks in Kensington. And you can imagine that Mr. Ullman is coming to talk business with him, and he says, by the way, I found this strange stone with mysterious writing on it. Would you like to have a look? Okay, to summarize, the physical evidence confirms that the linguistic evidence about the stone, that it was a fake made during the 19th century. The discovery, Olaf Ullman had the skill, the tools, and the knowledge to carve this stone, and we have witnesses that confirmed his involvement. Ullman's tracing, his staged discovery scene, and the various other misstatements that he made, or lies, shows that he's the person responsible for this hoax. And he also had a financial motive for creating this fake runestone in 1898 and going through this elaborate ruse of convincing his neighbors that he innocently found it. In fact, he kept the stump in the flattened ruins for a couple of years after 1898 and showed them to his neighbors if they wanted to see them. In spite of that, this illustration on the left is going to be what the popular imagination has on about this event. And as you probably know, you're going to have to negotiate the Conan the Barbarian fantasy world that lay people have and they believe about Minnesota history. There's something else I noticed yesterday when I was looking at this again. If you believe the account on the runestone about the death of these 10 men and all of that, it isn't the Viking who's beating the hell out of the Indians. It's the Indians who's beating the hell out of the Vikings. So even this is wrong. And what else can you say? You're probably not going to be confronted with a fake runestone. You're going to be confronted with something like a black duck pot containing a Mayan jade amulet wrapped in bark that has a carbon-14 date of 1362. Fakers are getting much more sophisticated, and I hope that you've learned something about this Kensington runestone investigation that might help you out with that kind of problem. And good luck, and I will take questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Harold. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. Again, if anyone has some questions, make sure you send them into the chat. Send it to Minnesota Archaeological Society, and I'll be happy to go through a list of questions that we have following the presentation.
Okay.
So the first question I have that came through was, what other tests would you like to be able to do on the runestone to further study it and disprove its validity?
Okay, a few years ago, if you've been following the runestone saga, there was a documentary made from a group in England, Arrow Media. They visited the Kensington Runestone Museum. They made a laser scan of the artifact, and they left a replica of a wooden boat with the museum. I don't know if you saw that documentary, but I was in communication with their researchers, and I had told them about the stucco layer. And I suggested that they get a carbon-14 date of the stucco layer. Stuccos and mortars can be dated by carbon-14 because what you have is lime, which is basically calcium oxide that's mixed with water, that when it dries out, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air to become calcite again. And so you would analyze that calcite, the carbon dioxide in that calcite, for the carbon-14 signature. They asked to sample the stone and do that, and it was refused. But that would be a determinative test that I think would take care of this matter. That would probably be the best thing to do with it. I don't know what other testing you could do. Maybe you have some suggestions. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Okay, the second question we had come in was, Scott Wolter said that other geologists have favorably reviewed his claims that the runestone is authentic. Are you familiar with how other geologists view the runestone?
Yes, I have, and his claim is not correct. And the source of his information is a chapter in a book that he and Richard Nielsen wrote together. And his chapter was a paper that he read in Stockholm in 2003. And his paper was reviewed by a panel of Swedish geologists, ruinologists, and other experts. And they gave him a considerable number of questions. They did not agree with his findings, and they wanted more work from him. As to these other geologists, well, some of them are not even geologists, and to what degree they agree with him is something is questionable. I would suggest if you're talking about a follow-up with Mr. Wolter, Mr. Wolter believes that the biotite in the Kensington Stone is older or more weathered than biotite in those main slates that he brought back from Maine, those samples. In general, slates have little or no biotite in them. It flows out of basic metamorphic petrology. And I would question whether or not those slates have biotite. And I would sit down with Mr. Walter, have him walk through with you and how he identified biotite. And then I would take that information, I'd put it on the record, get a recording of it, look at his exhibits, and bring them to experts in Maine. There's a petrographer from metamorphic petrology at the University of Maine. I might go to her. She's going to give a talk, in fact, at the geology department, the U of M here sometime during the next year. There are also geologists at the Maine Geological Survey. I would reach out to them and say, what do you think about this? Did Mr. Walter find biotite? And what do you think about his conclusions about that? I think that will clear up a lot of the issues that might come from Mr. Walter. Anything else?
Thank you. One more question. Someone was wondering if you could describe the methods used to identify the white material on the Kensington Stone as calcite. Is it based on visual inspection, chemical analysis, or some other method?
I did not identify it. I could not get permission to do an updated identification. Winchell identified it as calcite. I would suspect he'd use the traditional method you learn in geology lab at the beginning geology. We call it the fizz test. You put dilute hydrochloric acid on it and watch it effervesce. And that was known in the 19th century. He doesn't say how he identified it. Winchell had been the state geologist, was an experienced geologist. Flom also called it calcite. Walter called it calcite, and Walter used oil immersion to identify the scrapings from that as calcite. And that's a method I've used myself. And so that's a pretty reliable method. And I would love to sample it again if you want to. Like I said, we would love to sample that for the carbon-14 data. And obviously we would look at whether in fact it's calcite. And maybe I'm wrong, and then you'll have someone else give you a talk about the genuine artifact from Kensington.
Thank you. That is all of the questions that I had come into the chat. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
And thank you.